Good afternoon, and thank you very much. It is very good to be here with you all again on this second part of the discovery, discussion, investigation into trauma. So the last time we looked at trauma on an individual level, and I also want to look at it on a collective level. Because nothing can happen without a context. And we generally think of context as what is immediately visible and tangible to us. But there is a much bigger context that many people don't take into consideration. But I think it's quite important. So the traumas that people have are in an environment where, on the one hand, you may feel that you're the only one who is having your particular trauma, but when you widen the lens and you look at the bigger picture of your culture, your country, your race, your religion, you find that this bigger context contains elements that are traumatic for all of the people in that environment, in that context, in that culture. So what are these traumas that are so big that they impact everyone? So the most obvious is war. And wherever you have a war situation, especially if it's at the present time, because of social media, because of the internet, pretty much the whole world views it and experiences it in real time. And so I think at the moment we have a global trauma that is affecting all the people in the world, and that is quite new in a way. In previous wars, we would experience it in a way. Just the people who are interested in it, the people who are immediately impacted by it, the people who could afford to get the information and the media input. So it was limited. But now it's unlimited. The things that happen in war when you are on the end where you are seeing people getting destroyed, killed, raped, murdered, kidnapped, tortured, dismembered, violently treated, and so on. That leaves a very, very severe impact, which is known as post-traumatic stress disorder. It means it really damages people psychologically. And in that psychological damage, this also passes on through generations. This is something that is given as a legacy to other generations. So bearing that in mind, let us look at ourselves, regardless of what age we happen to be, but all of us are quite directly impacted by the legacy of the First World War and the Second World War. And there are some of us who are in parts of the world where there have been wars that are in a way distant from us personally, but which we know about. The Vietnam War, the Cambodian War, the Afghan War, different wars in the Middle East, wars in different parts of Africa. And all of these wars have spawned a vast sea of refugees who are experiencing the dangerous journey to find somewhere safe, which itself is also very traumatic. And in addition, what we have now is climate change refugees, people who have to leave their homes because the land where they live is no longer able to sustain them and they have to go. So there's a large portion of humanity experiencing a shared trauma, and which the longer it goes on, the more it is passed on to subsequent generations. And what this does is it creates behavior patterns that are very damaging to the self and very damaging to others around, which in turn creates more and more intensive circumstances of collective trauma. What happens to people who are victims of war or victims of climate change or victims of apartheid? They are completely disempowered in regard to those who prey upon them. And they're disempowered socially, financially, in terms of their sense of self-worth. It is a very highly destructive situation where everyone you see, your family members, your people that you go to school with, all are impacted, and they're in survival. So when you're in survival, one response is you hit back. And so this hitting back takes the form of increased crime and violent crime. Where you hit back, it may be not directly at those who have been the ones who caused this trauma to you, because you don't have access to them, but you hit back at your own people. You hit back at those that are close to you, in a sense, because it's safe, you know them. So even though you damage them, at the same time, there is an aspect of it being safe because they know you, and they won't necessarily hit back at you as badly as your initial trauma. But you're also in an environment where the initial beings or organizations that created the trauma, where it's a form of institutionalized trauma, then you are receiving further trauma when you react to that initial trauma. So it is something that builds upon itself. It's like a loop that you can never get out of. And this creates a very severe psychological damage. And somebody who is in that, it's actually very difficult to get out of it. Now, if you take this back a century or two or three or more, and you go back in history, you find that this type of trauma that is passed from generation to generation creates a destruction of culture. And people whose culture is destroyed, it's a very deep sense of identity that's destroyed. And the person becomes hollow, empty, a sense of worthlessness. And so, while also in survival, while also deeply wounded, the soul becomes creative. Because when you're in survival, there is something that kicks into the soul that says, no matter what, I cannot allow this to destroy me. So you become very creative. It doesn't apply to everyone who's experienced trauma, but it applies to some who become the face of the creative, positive response to that trauma. I think in most cases, it is the artists. One of the characteristics of an artist is to, as they say, if you give lemons, then if they give you lemons, then make lemonade. This is the expression where you are turning something bitter, something harsh, something horrible into creative music, theatre, novels, paintings, all different forms of art, because to express what you have experienced with what you can say a higher oriented spiritual energy is to present that trauma in a way that turns the ugliness into not necessarily beauty, but something which is striking, something which is meaningful, and something which shows the way through and the way out. And I think that those who are very spiritually inclined and who are also artistic, who are also creative, who are also resilient, you can say naturally resilient, and who connect themselves to a higher being, to a higher power, to the supreme being. These ones, I think, have a role to show us the way through, show us the way out, and show us the way to repair ourselves from all of these wounds that have disconnected us from ourselves. This kind of trauma fragments people, fragments communities, fragments society, and humanity is completely in a mess. And the trauma increases and increases and increases over the years, over the centuries, and but reaches a limit beyond which it cannot go. This is an interesting spiritual law that one can bear in mind. And the spiritual law says that when anything reaches its extreme, it turns around and goes the opposite direction. A little bit like a pendulum. It'll swing only to a certain point and then swing back the other way. And it continues like that. That's the speciality of a pendulum. And so for humanity, where trauma reaches a point of extreme, then instead of fragmenting the soul, fragmenting the communities, and leaving only devastation, it reaches a certain point where the trauma is so bad that it becomes good. That is to say, the extreme trauma, instead of fragmenting what has been fragmented to the maximum extent, turns and goes the opposite way, and it reintegrates a person. And instead of being fragmented, you transcend, you go beyond that extreme, and you return to a state which is complete. All the negativity vanishes because you have become reintegrated with yourself. And thus, you actually become even greater than you were in the first place as a result of managing and dealing with and getting through what is beyond human endurance. But you did it. You crossed a certain limit. And I think there are a few people who do it, and then once somebody has done it, or a small number of people have done it, then it opens up the way for other people to do it. And it becomes a kind of template where trauma becomes something that is not to be feared and loathed, but something that carries you to a transcendent state, which is a kind of spiritual experience and a great healing. So I do foresee that all of this trauma that is intensifying is leading to something that brings us to a state of integration, wholeness, love, where all of the negative reactions somehow vaporize and humanity becomes one with itself. And this is, I think, what we are on the brink of. I don't think very many people see it like this, but there are some who do. Most people, when they see that we're on the brink of something most terrifying, most destructive, people look at it with horror, thinking that it takes everyone to an abyss into which everyone falls, the eternal blackness. But in fact, it doesn't. It takes you to a point where all the darkness goes away and you are faced with the light of truth and meaningfulness beyond. And you also reintegrate all the fragmented parts of yourself that are fragmented over many, many, many traumas, over many, many incarnations. You see yourself in this context of eternity, which you can, the long, long context of history, and see yourself coming back to your heart. You are more than repaired. We do go through repairing, but the state of becoming once again completely whole, completely integrated, is greater than repair, because you transcend the fragmented state and you come into a completely integrated state. So I see this as something like an analogy you could look at, which is a very well-known analogy, the analogy of what happens in a chrysalis, where the caterpillar just absolutely disintegrates into a gray, gooey mess that doesn't resemble anything. And all of a sudden, a butterfly is formed, and it breaks out of the chrysalis and dries its wings for a little bit and then flies away into the sunshine. And this is really the very, very well-known and good metaphor for that transcendent transfiguration that lies in front of us. And when you have a little inkling of this, then you're no longer mentally connected with everything that's gone wrong, everything that's broken, everything that's lost, but you turn your attention away to what is becoming whole and becoming true and becoming pure. And you allow that to happen to you. It's a kind of surrender. Because when you've lost everything and there's nothing more to lose, you can do that. And you can rise above the catastrophic circumstances and find again your humanity, so that instead of reacting and adding to the fragmentation, you become the instrument for everything to become whole again. So this is how I see the present moment. What happens when you see the present moment like that? You start thinking differently and looking at people differently, more compassionate. You don't operate on the basis of revenge and reactiveness, but you see the possibilities, and your mind is filled with the anticipation of those possibilities, which is a very empowering thing. So when you're empowered in this way, you gather your strength, and you, I think, attract to yourself people who are either they see this already or they're ready to see it, but maybe there's a twinkle in your eye that says, you know what, I know something, I found something. I know that now we're on the edge of something so magnificent, so beautiful, that we can actually get through these dark times, looking at them not as an end, but as a gateway. You go through a gateway and you arrive somewhere else. There's another analogy I might add to this picture, and that is the lagoons in the South Pacific. They are inside the reefs, which were created by ancient volcanoes. And then there's usually an island in the middle, which is the new volcano emerging. And the lagoon is this circular area of beautiful, gentle turquoise waters filled with colorful fish, but also sometimes dangerous ones. And then there are gateways out of the lagoon into the big ocean. And these gateways are guarded by sharks. So you have this wall of sharks in between the lagoon and the ocean. And if you want to go to the ocean, you have to pass through the wall of sharks. But if your goal is the ocean and you want to see further than the comfort of the little lagoon, then you have to go through the wall of sharks. So I think for us also, when we're dealing with individual and collective trauma, or you're seeing the individual trauma in the context of the collective trauma, and you have seen the transcendent possibilities, instead of hating and fearing your trauma, you embrace your trauma, and you are wanting to move beyond the limitations that it has set for you. You start to work through your pain, repair, and ultimately you're ready to go into the much wider context of the bigger ocean. And that is where we move on collectively from the world as it has been into what is possible, into a world where people have turned their backs on this endless intensification of man's inhumanity to man, you can say. And we turn the other way, and we embrace our own humanity, we embrace everyone, and we move forward into a renewal of civilization. What we have come out of, we wouldn't call it civilized, we call it uncivilized. It is really uncivilized what people are doing to each other at the present time, in the present sort of wars of different areas and the polarities and polarizations and conflict that comes from these polarizations into a new way. This is what I see as coming. Of course, it's not here, it's not visible, but there are some, maybe visionaries or some who have a role to anticipate it in advance and who start moving in that direction. And then maybe others will say, hey, let's go where that one's going, because it looks a lot more positive than just falling into an abyss of nothingness, which is the alternative. So I think our work is to be full of light and keep that twinkle in the eye that says, hey, I know where we're going, and I know what's next, and let's go. And in that way, I think that we can become heroes in our own way and be very helpful for others around us, inspiring, and move forward. And this is how I see where we're going and what's possible for us. So then the question arises, when we're talking about something so opposite of the direction that we have been going in, people will say, well, this is dreaming, and we have that song, that well-known John Lennon song called Imagine. And this is what is needed, really, to turn our minds to something higher and transcendent and begin the process of absorbing what is positive, not in a sense of avoiding the negative, but to be able to overlay the negative with a positive sense of self, and a faith in the essential purity of the human soul, the human spirit, and to understand that this spiritual law that says when everything reaches its extreme, it goes in the other direction. And ask yourself, is this bad enough yet? And I think we can say, yes, it is bad enough, definitely bad enough. Let us go the other way. Let the pendulum swing the other way, and let me swing on that pendulum, go in that direction in my mind, and begin to do the thoughts, words, and actions that correspond to that, and create an energy that is a kind of leadership energy. A leader is somebody that other people follow. And so if you're going somewhere that people feel interested in, they will follow. And so you just go where that light is leading you. You recognize the light of truth, the light of purity, the light of optimism, and to understand the light of knowledge about the laws of spirituality, because they do operate. We're not just in the laws of physics, they're operating in a tangible way, and the laws of spirituality are much less tangible, but they operate very powerfully. So anyone who can detect them, who can feel them, and who can have that, I suppose, courage to take the risk to go according to that and go the opposite direction of everybody else, can in some ways turn the tide. And then your attitude towards the trauma is, in a sense, neutral, and in another sense, the trauma that you have seen, witnessed, experienced, been the prey of, that trauma is turned into something very powerful, that's no longer a handicap, but becomes an instrument to carry you forward in a more competent manner than you had been if there hadn't been any trauma. So in that way, you're really turning something negative into something seriously positive.
Sister Denise, you have proven yourself once again to me as a revolutionary because you're seeing things differently from almost every one of us here right now. And indeed, it gives us a different way of looking at what is there, what is what they call reality, but you are bringing us into a place where we can really be thinking better and having an upliftment in our minds. And I would even say it's a shift, considering that when we talk of trauma, it's always that of loss, of brokenness. But this afternoon, you proved to us that we can go in another level of looking at trauma. As you were saying, this extreme trauma can lead us to transcendence. Indeed, Sister Denise, I do believe you are a real revolutionary to think in a way that is so different from what people would really think about trauma. So I would just like to expound more on this spiritual experience, how we integrate ourselves even with the most extreme trauma that we have experienced.
Well, it's quite a different type of approach, definitely, I do agree. And I've been thinking about it for a while because the question of trauma is very much on my mind. I've been closely following the problems of the world because you see what you have is you have one story from the, you can say, mainstream media, and then you have a completely opposite story from the alternative media. And there's a big polarization there. And the mainstream media says, you know, everything is okay. We are in charge of the situation. There's no problem. Don't worry. Go back to sleep, as it were. And then the alternative media is saying, wakey, wakey. We're in very, very dangerous moments here. And we have to be very, very aware. And we have to really think about what needs to be done. And so these are very opposing messages that the world is experiencing. And behind all of that, I'm fortunate enough to have access to really extraordinary spiritual information that I study and practice. And it is very different from the conventional, what I would call more religious approach to spirituality. It came to my mind that all of our human problems, if you go back to the original scriptures of the different religions, it all starts with, you know, fall from grace, getting fallen out of paradise, having a problem with God, having a problem with each other. And I think that's a kind of initiating trauma, because if you get thrown out of paradise, that's quite traumatic. And I'm also very aware of this idea that the soul is eternal and immortal. And of course, the body is perishable. But if you think about eternity and immortality, which is very difficult to think about, but nevertheless, we do attempt to think about it, because it means moving away from a more linear type of thinking to a more circular or spherical type of thinking. And so it got me thinking that there has to be one kind of trauma to break us into pieces. And how are we going to get whole again? So I thought, well, it is possible for another kind of trauma to bring us back together again. You know, we have the story of Humpty Dumpty falling in pieces, and then he got put back together again. And I think some of these little fairy tales and children's stories are kind of myths that hide quite important information for us. And so I was thinking along the lines that, yeah, when you put together this idea with some of the laws of spirituality, and the one I was taking up is the one that says that when everything reaches its extreme, it's over and you go to something completely different. And so I thought that, yeah, this means that the extremes that we are in at the moment is actually a natural circumstance that propels us, whether we like it or not, into a transcendent state. And I feel that it is happening. And I also observe or hear about that there are people who are actually able to really make it through the most severe circumstances of all, come through it, come out of it, and become like reset, reborn, filled with some grace, you can say. And so I'm seeing that there is a great deal of optimism for us here. We just have to look at things differently from the sort of idea of continuing down a negative road that leads just to the edge of an abyss down which everybody falls endlessly. That doesn't really have to be the case. And I favor much more the logic of, this pendulum which swings from left to right, right to left endlessly. It doesn't have any problem, but every time it reaches an extreme, it goes back to the other direction. So that's where I get my optimism from.
I just have a question here, sister, and I hope you could answer this. How do we collectively address the global trauma? Can we be able to collectively address the global trauma too?
I think that the global trauma is out of our range to address individually, and collectively we are not sufficiently aligned with each other. I do think part of what we have to do is align with each other. And the work that I do at the moment is very much connected with experimenting with working closely with small groups of people who are on the same page as me and who are studying the same material as I do, and working with it in such a way so that it's almost as if we have, like, say we're a group of a dozen people, 12 people with one soul. That means the power of the soul, like 12 souls made into one soul, not that it's actually one soul, but they're so lined up that the power of getting things done that one person can do is insufficient. But you put 12 and a great deal more can be accomplished because the minds are completely aligned. So if you could do that with 12, you could do that with 12 million. Potentially. So I think if you can experiment with working on bringing the minds of like-minded people to a situation where you're so clear about what's what and where you're going and so on, that you go there collectively. And I think that, okay, maybe you can't get 12 million people because there's too many and everybody has their minds are going in all different directions. But if you have even a relatively small group of people, which is very potent because it's aligned, very clearly aligned with that transcendent positive vision. Others are kind of pulled into it and go in that direction. A little bit like if you have a water which is held by a dam, and then there's a little hole in that dam, a little bit of water comes through, but the pressure builds up and it breaks, and then all the water goes through. It's a little bit like that kind of idea. Because I think that to get everyone collectively to consciously think in a aligned way is not practical. But if you have something that's really inspiring and that really catches people's like a visionary that catches people's attention, and they say yes, not because they're necessarily thinking about it too clearly because it's complex, but more like a recognition, that yes, this is the way to go, and then they go. And then I think we can collectively do something that works, but we have to have a very great inspiration to do that. And this is where I think when things go really, 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 really bad, then people turn their minds to God because everything else has failed. And so when you have everyone turning their mind to God and some who are really connected, then, God stands for purity, creativity, a beautiful world, integration. Everything is logical and coherent and good for humanity, good for nature, and not destructive. That is enough to turn people in the right direction. And then there are higher powers that carry us forward that are beyond us. And so I see some kind of possibilities like this.
It's a follow-up question actually. And it's more like, how could there be spirituality amidst the trauma?
Yes, I understand that question. Well, because anyway, trauma happens to the body, of course, but more than anything, it happens to the soul, to the spirit. I think that when trauma is at a certain intensity, which I would call the extreme, then there is a mechanism within the soul that turns it around. And it goes towards the pure and the original. And this is where the analogy of the pendulum comes into play, that you cannot make a pendulum go further than its furthest point. It won't go. It just, anyway, has the power to go the other way. And I think there's something like that in the soul, that when it gets to the extreme, it cannot go any further, and it has this force that puts it going the other way and into the way of balance and harmony. Harmony with each other, harmony with nature. All of this is like a flips.
You were reminding us once again about that song entitled Imagine. And yes, it takes a visionary really to see things in a different way. And you talked about absorbing positivity and having faith in this essential purity of the human spirit. Can you do a little more expansion on this particular subject?
Well, people tend to look at humanity as good people and bad people. But from a spiritual point of view, all people are fundamentally pure, peaceful, powerful, loveful, blissful beings of light. And when a person does things that we classify as really bad, this is one of the products of trauma. And so it's a distortion of the soul. Now, when the soul goes the other way, it undistorts all of the distortions. And we have to cease to classify each other as good people and bad people, and understand that all of us are traumatized people, and traumatized people react to that trauma in different ways, none of which is healthy. You know, in psychology, they talk about fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. So the people who fight, they may be the aggressive types, or they may be the sort of the revolutionaries who fight back. And then there's the flight, and you run away, you avoid. So a large number of people just avoid dealing with it. And then the freeze, you just become numb. And a lot of people numb themselves with social media, with alcohol, with drugs, with sport, with various ways to numb the self. And then fawn is where you kind of try and be so nice to the nasty people that they don't hurt you anymore. None of these things are effective, but a lot of people react in those kinds of ways. This is a very general picture of it, but it lets you see that we have to get beyond these actions and reactions that are just part of the effect of trauma, and understand about the extreme, because when you get to the extreme, those laws don't work anymore. Different laws come into place, which is what I'm talking about, the laws of spirituality, which are different from psychological things, and they really take everyone the other way. You will also feel inside of yourself an urge to do things differently. You will feel yourself dying and getting reborn differently. All these things will be happening. Maybe you don't know what's going on, but if there are people who are thinking about it and talking about it, then you have a language which, if you talk about it widely enough, people might be able to recognize, okay, yeah, I'm feeling this, this is what it means. Not, doesn't mean I'm going crazy. It doesn't mean I'm falling in pieces. It means I'm going back to my original state, and I'm doing like what happens in the chrysalis. This butterfly is spontaneously happening, and now I'm not an old caterpillar anymore. I am becoming something different. And sort of it needs to come into the narrative so that people can connect with it and feel comfortable about it and allow it to move forward. Yeah.
Can you tell us more about the chrysalis? What happens that the chrysalis is able to fly after several moments of silence, or how would you call that, sister? The chrysalis is a moment of time when the butterfly is still not able to flip its wings.
It's not a gradual process at all. The first thing that happens is, okay, the caterpillar spins the silk around itself that becomes the chrysalis, so it hardens. And the caterpillar, I mean, it goes somewhere, it hides behind a door or something, and it just has to sit there for a long time while metamorphosis takes place. But so first thing that happens is the caterpillar melts and becomes this goo. So if you would slit open the chrysalis at that point, you would just find only just the jelly-like substance inside. And then what happens during that process is you get something known as imaginal cells. And these imaginal cells are like cells that form within that disintegrated caterpillar, but the disintegrated caterpillar kills those imaginal cells, but then new ones come and they increase, and eventually the old caterpillar cannot kill them anymore and they take over, and it's very rapid that they suddenly take the form of this butterfly, which is then ready to break open the chrysalis and just dry its wings for a minute or two, and then it flies off. And so it's very magical because it's so sudden. We're used to seeing things happen in an evolutionary way, so it's a slow process that takes millions of years. But in fact, in the metaphor of the chrysalis, there can be catastrophic change, and catastrophic change can be catastrophically bad or catastrophically good. And what I'm seeing is that we've done catastrophically bad already, badly enough, and now we're at a point where catastrophically good starts happening. And so we need some sort of reference point, some sort of metaphor that helps us understand it or create a picture of it. And so this idea that, okay, we may be imaginal selves in the context of the human world. And when you do something different, there's a philosopher called Schopenhauer who talked about this. And if you are like an instrument for change, so the first time you talk about these things, people ridicule you and say you're nuts and you're crazy and it's not possible, and they try and kind of make you go away like that. But then you persist and you carry on a bit further, and then the reaction is violent and destructive. So the larger society tries to get rid of you and destroy you and put you in jail or kill you, or whatever that happens to be. If you can get through that, you get to the third stage, which is, oh yeah, everybody knew that was what it is. And you suddenly get completely accepted and you become the narrative instead of the other narrative. And it's a phenomenon which he did describe. He is a German philosopher from the late 19th century. And I found it very interesting what he was saying about it. And I think it applies here, you see. And so some people are like imaginal selves, and then they become like instruments for change, and then it happens.
Individual trauma can become disempowering and highly destructive. And it could also lead us to disconnect and can lead to death. However, the one who's asking this believes that what you said, that with our resilience, it can lead to greater human endurance and higher spiritual integration. The question is, how can we practice the coping of collective transcendation and resilience versus trauma?
I think you have to look at it a little differently, because you can't practice something that happens spontaneously. If you say, okay, let me work through my trauma, and then you have to understand that there is higher powers, higher energy that will use the fact that you have done this work, and you will find yourself being used by destiny as an instrument of change. And you have to allow that, because you can't control everything. Mostly you can't control much. People want to control everything and everyone, but it's mostly out of your hands. You do your own work, and then you kind of offer yourself to the greater energies that are operating to bring this world into a perfectly harmonious state. This is not something an individual can do, but an individual who does what an individual should do in these cases becomes part of the change process. And you have to kind of offer yourself for that and allow yourself to be used for that without trying to control it.
On an individual level, when one is still trapped in the depression of their past trauma, there is no power to even call on to God. What do we do?
You do have choice, you see. You're in front of a big black hole and you have no power. So in the 12-step program of addiction recovery called Alcoholics Anonymous, they're really looking at that's the starting point. And the first thing you have to do is admit that you are completely powerless over your addiction or your depression or whatever it is. And you have to turn yourself over to God and surrender. The problem is trying to control everything and take think that you don't have any choice. You always have choice. If you can't do anything, you surrender to God. That's a very good choice. But people don't really think of it as a choice, but it is a choice.
Of course, you said it, the pendulum swings on its extreme, and then, of course, there's no other recourse but to get to the other way. And we have to create an energy. And you mentioned about the light. Can you expound more on this, sister? Creating the energy.
You cannot create the energy. You're completely disempowered. You have to give up the idea that you can control things that are beyond your control. But what you can do is understand that, okay, things are getting to a point of extreme, and you just have to know they're at that point where they're going the other way. And if you surrender yourself to God and to the higher circumstances that are beyond your control, this is out of your control, and you have to surrender to it. This is a very important piece of human spiritual practice. It's called let go and let God. Have you heard that expression before? So you just have to get to a point of realizing that you cannot control circumstances, and you have to take a leap of faith and let go. And then you find that you can go in the right direction. This is the problem, is this trying to control everything.
So perhaps you can already lead us at this point of time, sister, to for us to connect to our Almighty God, so that we can be the visionary that we all would wish to be, and in the twinkle of the eye.
Yes. Well, so first of all, we must be aware that I am something really very small in the big drama of the human story. I am just a little spark of light, and I'm tossed around in the winds of change and trauma and so on. And I do not have any control over it, but I have to understand some things. The first thing to understand is that I am an eternal, immortal, indestructible being of light. And so it is impossible to die. You can leave your body, yes, but you cannot stop existing. This is very important. There is no chance to die. And therefore, one must surrender. Surrender to the reality that I am inextinguishable, indestructible. I am not my body. My body is perishable. I am not. Circumstances anyway change. Nothing is the same. It's always in a state of flux. But I am permanent. And I put myself in the hands of God and let myself be there, let myself be moved by the Supreme Being, because I have no control over what's going on in the material world. And so I need to shift my consciousness to the spiritual state. I am an eternal being of light.
Om Shanti. We're all smiling here, sister, in the space that we have here in our space. And I think this afternoon you have brought us to see the light, because the pendulum which has been swinging far off to the darkness is now getting its swing to the opposite side. And I think this afternoon it is a big take for all of us to see ourselves not wallowing in the dark, but rather switching ourselves to the biggest light of all, and being able to recognize the supreme presence of God in our lives. Thank you very much, sister, for this wonderful event that you have shared with us again, your vision and your revolutionary ideas that things can always change.